It's a privilege to have Tim to continue this conversation. This isn't the coffee break, everyone. Just sit down. Coffee break after. So Tim, of course, has just gone back to academia after 2 years as in the White House, a special assistant to the president for technology and competition. A number of times you've come up in the earlier conversation, Tim, and so I'm sure you have a number of points to make, but I wanted to ask you to help us go through the build-up towards this pivotal point that was the executive order of 2021, in which you played a major part, and which was effectively a major watershed. It was perceived in this way also in Europe, perhaps not immediately, but has become to be seen a major watershed in the administration as to how the conception of how we do policy, how we do antitrust, as part of that, should be pursued. You want to take us through it?
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And no, this is working. This conference is extraordinary. I mean, already, I just want to congratulate you for putting this a group of people together, and also give you a lot of credit for making this free and open to the public. I think it's obvious you could charge a lot of money for the quality of the product here, and I just want to give you credit for that. No.
Thank you.
So, speaking, the executive order has been mentioned a few times, and I do think, as all of the previous speakers and the panel and the commissioner were saying earlier, that there is a sense that things are changing and not going back. That we're talking about a big change, particularly in the United States, almost a cycle kind of change. Someone before going to government. And now again, I'm in academia, and I've been interested in the long trends of antitrust and related enforcement and policy. They tend to go through these sort of 30-year cycles, and 30 or 40-year cycles. And we went through what was called an antitrust winter in the early 2000s, which was already described, a period very focused on prices, focused on the idea that if you got stuff cheap, that would be almost and let everything be offshore, that would be fine for the American economy. I think there has been a decisive turn, and the question is, as you asked, how did that happen? Leading up to the executive order on competition, I think it starts with the president and the sense that the president really wanted to change. He wanted at a very big, high level kind of level, change the distribution of power and wealth in the economy and who was getting served by it, and bring back. And I think this is very tied to the project of trying to preserve and protect democracy. United States, there was a sense we had a near miss with potential loss of some of our democratic principles, including the accepting of election results, and a sense that unless government was shown to be an entity capable of serving more of the people, the entire country, and not, just allow certain entire regions, entire classes be left behind in favor of enriching a smaller elite, that we could lose, even though the United States democracy is very old and has strong institutions, that it could weaken and even be lost. So I think these projects were connected in Joe Biden's mind. And he is not a detail-oriented, I have a theory for how we should interpret Section 7 of the Clayton Act kind of guy. It wasn't like that. It was like, what do we do to really turn the corner? What do we do to do FDR kind of things, Theodore Roosevelt kind of things, move back to a different approach to the American economy? If you study American history, you'll notice that every revolution is styled as a counter-revolution, return. Even the original revolution around the American revolutionaries wanted their rights as Englishmen. They wanted an earlier era, and I think in the United States, in this era, we go back either to FDR or the progressive era, Louis Brandeis, a sense maybe even earlier 19th century Andrew Jackson kind of ideas. We want to go back to an era where the economy seemed to work for a lot of people. It seemed to be a land of opportunity. It seemed to be a country where broad, sustainable prosperity seemed a possibility with a strong middle class. And the ability to kind of make it on your own and have a considerable amount of economic liberty and freedom. And that's the direction. And like as I said, and I don't think President didn't give specific directions, but he said this is what we want in economic policy. And our return was we need to reboot and bring back the antitrust tradition in this country, the anti-monopoly tradition, the effort to make it serve a broad range of groups. And so after 4 or 5 months of very hard work and a lot of wrangling and so forth, we got there with the executive order. One thing that I think that brought the president into it and gave this his backing, and I'll say that his support has been an extraordinarily important part of this. He chairs meetings of the cabinet secretaries and other agency heads, including Rohit, every 6 months in a meeting called the Competition Council meeting. He's there physically, and that's been very important. And I think for him in particular, the idea that this could be extended and be important, not just for consumers, but also for labor, for farmers, for small business was a big part of it. So that's kind of the thinking that went into it. The day-to-day meetings are too tedious to get into. But I think I'll say one last thing about it. Almost people talked about siloing and so forth. We didn't use that word very often, but there was a very important degree to which in the crafting of the executive order, in the president's involvement, in the stating of here is my anti-monopoly policy, here are the basic tenets this administration believed in, we brought competition policy out of a small little delegated thing, let those experts take care of it, this is really complicated, don't have anyone interested, you don't have any political leaders involved, just leave it to the experts. Almost by having the president be involved and speak in it, having the White House set, the idea of competition policy, that by itself moved competition policy into economic policy, which is where it belongs. I mean, the question of how concentrated your economy is, how competitive your industry is, how can that not be economic policy? But for some reason, for a long time, we're like, well, those guys will do a good job. And, I was also in the Obama White House, and by the end of it, we're like, what happened? How did suddenly every industry become what was going on over there in merger? And like, well, they were taking care of it. And, but they're taking care of it was like, okay, every merger goes forward. You know what I mean? Like there was the green light, and there was no real political oversight in a sense. I mean, anyway, sorry, that's a very long answer.
No, but it touches exactly the key points. So, and indeed, the State of the Union address earlier, not just the executive order, but the State of the Union address recently has been, I guess, I think one of the first time that the president has mentioned competition in that context for 50 years or something like that.
He said the word antitrust, which is what got all the antitrust people fired up.
But a key point you make is this notion that, and I keep pursuing this as a theme, that somehow we've pushed antitrust into a specialist sport, something specialist that the expert do, the expert economists, the expert lawyers, and no one else can look into it because it's a church. And this is really the big change that I think is coming down, the notion that it is not a specialist activity. And as an instrument of policy, it has to play a much more ambitious role.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, there's a lesson here from the New Deal era that I think is pretty important. One of the major contests in the New Deal era, and one of the reasons I think people were so upset was this question of, at that time, whether Congress gets to make economic policy or not. right? Democratically elected Congress. And the judiciary at that point was like, no, you don't get to make those decisions. This is the Lochner era. You know, these decisions are constitutional. And I think anytime you take economic decisions, which frankly are so important to day-to-day life, and say, well, these are away from the democratic process entirely. You know, we have either constitutionalized it or expertized it in some way that it isn't something that people have some say in. I'm not saying, you know, you should have a referenda to decide what the interest rate is or something like that. But, you know, if people are completely dislocated from that, I think it begins to breed considerable discontent, a sense of government being non-responsive, and ultimately anti-democratic pressures that become intense. So I think that was part of the thinking, that we cannot allow this part, which frankly, and when you add it more broadly and talk about the essential industries and regulate things like broadband, and you say, well, this, you know, the regulation of broadband is also somehow off limits, has nothing to, it's an expert thing. Yes, you're paying, you know, $150 a month and have no choices, but you know, we did an analysis and that's what's good for you. You know, that doesn't go over too well. And I think that's why, you know, we were talking about the attorney generals getting into it. They're closer to the ground. I also work in the attorney general's office. They see the anger. Senator Amy Klobuchar, you know, has become a strong convert to the anti-monopoly cause. Maybe she'd say she was always there, but partially by going around the country and seeing, you know, and seeing that people are angry on the ground. And so, you know, when democracies are unresponsive to their people in economic matters, as I said, I think that's brews trouble, and it can happen a lot of different ways, and one of the ways is by assuming the experts have got it.
You mentioned the way in which, I mean, when one hears Americans speak about this, you use words that to Europeans are somewhat, it's not the language we use every day, you know, the anti-monopoly movement. Monopolies are responsible for loss of democracy. We don't have quite this discourse in Europe, but it is incredibly evocative to me, because I think we somehow miss out from not having this kind of clarity. Now, you talk about how markets concentrating serially has been something that snuck up on us, okay? We ended up at the end of the Obama era saying, what happened, right? We have 3 firms when there were 9, in agrochemical, in pharmaceutical, in telecoms. What went wrong, and why is that not going to happen again? Or can we concentrate any further? What's going to happen there?
No, it's a great it's a great question. I mean, I think there were a number of priorities that we had coming into government, and one of them was to reboot merger enforcement. Sometimes I thought we should just sort of repass the Anti-Merger Act of 1950 and say, you know, it meant what it said. It was designed to, in their incipiency and other points, have some control over the concentration or uncompetitiveness of different industries. But what went wrong? You know, if you look back at some of the mergers, maybe since I'm not in government, I can talk about the controversial ones. You know, if you think about something like the Facebook-Instagram merger, and you look carefully at what was going on there, through extraordinarily complicated analysis, a group of experts at the agencies and outside was able to determine that Facebook and Instagram were not competitors. I think it takes an extraordinary of learning to reach a conclusion that absurd. You know, and somehow Waze and Google Maps were also somehow not competitors, or something happened there. I mean, a lot of it is different. You used the word last night, I know it was probably exculpatory narratives. And I think that
what we do.
I mean, I don't want to blame the economics profession, but I think the financial incentives for creating convincing exculpatory narratives drove part of the story, and the other part of the story was this willingness of the agencies to learn, but to accept that. But you know, it's very easy to, you know, there were a lot of work going on. I was there. You know, there's a lot of work going on. It feels like very strong, but you can lose sight from the 20,000 for a 50,000 foot view that in tech, for example, there was over 1,000 mergers during that era and no challenges. And if in the United States, by big platforms, over 1,000 mergers. And each one has its own little story. But you know, if you have like if you have something, you know, it's like a referee that never calls a foul or something like that. You know, if that never happens, maybe something was going on. I think that's what became clear.
Thank you. I would like to ask the panel to now join us, Barry, Andrea, Andreas, and then Tommaso, who we can see on screen, but I unfortunately couldn't make it in person today. Tim, please stay,
Sure.
And we will continue. I think there are enough chairs for everyone, and Rod, we are somewhat distant, but we can, yeah, over here, sit next to me. So I think that Tim has teed up extremely well the discussion we're going to have next, and the way in which is set up there is, do we need new laws or do we need new posture? In a sense, it is something which has been set up by Tim and indeed Rohit and Rana. In some way, when you think of enforcement, sometimes you hear back, but you know, we can't stretch too much because we don't have the law. The law isn't really there. We cannot be doing what we would like to do because we are framed by the law that we have. And of course, for the legal community, there is a strong emphasis on, but that's the law, that's the law, that's what we do. And yet, the question really is, do we need new laws, or is it a question of posture? I mean, to Rohit's point earlier, the agencies in the US at the moment are clearly pushing. In Europe too, there is clearly an effort to expand. And so what are the limitations and how far can this go? Let me start, however, with Barry, because Barry, again, has been someone who has been very key to the expansion of the discussion in this field. He has very much been someone who has driven this vision of a different understanding of how we should do antitrust and the anti-monopoly movement. So Barry, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you, Christina. And this is it's a great event you've put together once again, but I actually think this is the best one yet. So you asked me to kind of maybe build a little bridge or help build a bridge between where the United States is and Europe is right now. And I'll try. I think every so often a generation comes to understand that it has an opportunity to renew our society and to remake our world. And this is true for us here in this room today. Dean Acheson was the Secretary of State for President Truman right after the war. And he had a big hand in the Marshall Plan and the Schuman Plan, the creation of the OECD, the reestablishment of Germany and Japan on new foundations of democracy and prosperity. In 1970, in his book, President at the Creation, Acheson remembered this work with a simple sentence. It was our search with others for means and methods to bring about peace and security. Today, we in this room, we also have an opportunity to establish a foundation to ensure peace and security and a sustainable prosperity for the next century. In short, to create a new world. Now, earlier we heard Vice President Vestager speak of the historic times of geopolitical change. Indeed, although most of you know me from my work in anti-monopoly, I stumbled into this work in a very roundabout way. More than 20 years ago, I began to study dangerous choke points in international production. I focused first on Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. You guys have heard of TSMC, I'm sure. I focused on how extreme concentration of vital capacity, in this case to make semiconductors, posed a threat to the stability of our most basic systems of supply, and posed a threat to our sovereignty, even a threat of war. My fear was that these choke points would tempt other nations to try to force our democracies to compromise politically in exchange for the goods we need to live. precisely as Russia has done with Germany due to the extreme dependence on Russian oil and gas. I wrote a whole book on this. It was called End of the Line. It was back then that I realized that anti-monopoly is political economy, is how we regulate power and structure, is how we engineer democracy at home and an open, liberal, peaceful world around us. It was back then that I also realized that the reason we face these new threats was because the Chicago School intellectual counter-revolution had destroyed our understanding of the structures of power and control and how to make such structures safe. And by hiding that, had put all that is dear to us at risk. And now here we are, with war in the heart of Europe, with war threatened in the heart of Asia, with political wars at home, and in each case, these wars are due largely to choke points over energy, industrial production, communications. There's something that very few people remember today. It was that Dean Acheson was a disciple of Louis Brandeis. He clerked for Brandeis for 2 years. Acheson's best friend was Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, another disciple of Brandeis. Back in the day, monopolists routinely charged Brandeis and his friends with being naive. They said Brandeis was backward-looking, that he sought a lost utopia. Yet what Acheson reminds us is that those who helped to rebuild European democracy and prosperity were disciples of Brandeis. Those who helped establish the long European peace, the long great power peace, were disciples of Brandeis. Those who helped keep democracy safe, like Andreas Mundt, here to my right, are disciples of Brandeis. It is these disciples of Brandeis who were and are the true realists, who understood how to break power and bend power in ways that enable us to build something that actually looks a little like utopia. What exactly did they do? What were their means and methods? It was to distribute industrial capacity and distribute economic opportunity and distribute voice and control and distribute risk. Their moral purpose was always to protect the many from the few, but their immediate focus was always on structure, and the practical effects were redundancy, resiliency, stability, innovation, true efficiency, and international community and peace. Today, we walk through the cathedral that Acheson and Schumann and Monet and Adenauer built, and we think it is crumbling. It is falling. And we fear that we don't know how to fix it. Those who built the cathedral, we think, were great men, giant men, with superhuman insight. And we fear that we are just little people. What I say to you today is that every one of you in this room has in your power to be a great person, to be someone whose name will shine in the book to be written 20 years hence, present at the recreation. If you dare to join in relearning the means and methods of making true democracy and making true peace, which is to use anti-monopoly law and trade law to engineer safe structures. So to answer the prompt we were given, we don't need new law. We need to follow Brandeis's teaching, which is nothing more than to use the laws as they were originally written by the people in their common and democratic wisdom.
Great. Well, what a way to start us off. So let me turn to Andreas Mundt. We talked a lot about the US, of course, this morning because of the sense that the US is in the throes of this historic change. But Andreas, how do you perceive any constraint that you may be under for doing what you want to do coming from the law? In fact, Germany is in a unique position because, as we all know, you've been able to actually update for example, your laws in ways that allow you to take action, for example, in digital in a way that is being seen and described as quite speedy and effective. So you are perhaps in a uniquely advantageous position in that respect. But please give us your view and more generally on what you heard today.
Yeah, Christina, first of all, very happy to speak after Barry because I think that fits. Secondly, I'm very happy to be here in presence because last year I was here virtually and I had a camera in front of me and they had promised to me it would follow my face. Instead, it followed my left shoulder the whole time. And I heard Christina go, Andreas, we only see your shoulder. So I'm very happy to be here in person this year. AI isn't perfect yet, I would say. Well, I would like to talk a bit. I would start in the US and then come to Europe and then come to Germany maybe. Maybe a few words on the US. The topic of the panel is law or posture. I think what we see in the US for the time being is a very strong tendency to change posture. And I really admire what people like Tim, like Lina Khan, Jonathan Kanter, who will also speak today, are doing. Because they try to change the application of competition law for the better of consumers. And I think that is not only a shift within the agency. You need to shift the spirit. You need to shift the mind. You need to shift the spirit of the business community, of the stakeholders. And I think to do that only by coming into an agency or coming into the White House saying, we're not going to change the law, we just change the application of the law. I think that is really hard to do. I think it was a step that was kind of overdue, taking a little step back from the Chicago school, taking a little step back from a very, very narrow interpretation of the consumer welfare standard, very much focused on short-term price effects for the benefit of the consumer. And I think what we can really watch in the US, in the DOJ, in the FTC, is to try to make that shift without any change of the law, just by the posture within the agency, just by trying to apply the law in a more Brandeisian way, Barry, in the future, and to come to that shift. I don't know if that works. Because what you have to have in mind, in the end, it is never a competition agency that takes the decision, it's the court. And the court relies heavily on law. And that is not only a question of posture. And this is why it is so exciting to see what is going to happen in the US. Are they going to bring the cases also through courts? We see the change of posture in the agency, but it will be exciting to see what is happening at the stage of the courts. If you look at Europe, I think we have here a little bit of a pendulum. We come from the early 2000s, where the more economic approach, the effects-based approach, all these kind of ideas grew. It has made cases more complex, it has made cases lengthy. We see in the big tech area how lengthy they get, how complex they get, and maybe this is why we must get at least a little bit away from proving actual effects, more go in the direction of likely effects. If you look at big tech, I think this is also why I see Philip Lowe here in the room, why there are many academics and important scholars who say that maybe the Commission these days should take a closer look at the priorities paper on Article 102. I look at Philip because that was a large debate between us many, many years ago, but I think that is something that should be looked at least in a certain way. In Germany, I must say, I'm proud to say that at least I have tried to combine the best of the two worlds. We were not close to the more economic approach, but we did not make a complete shift of our approach, but we said this is a good opportunity to refine our economic toolbox within the Bundeskartellamt. That was the approach that we took, but we have also always kept a little bit of a focus on the structural parameters of the markets. And I'm very happy that today, that even in this room, I can speak out the words structural preconditions for competition. If I had done that 10 years ago in this room, I knew the headlines the next day. Germany. Andreas Mund still hasn't got it. No economics in Bonn, nothing at all. An economic desert, you know, that would have been the headline.
I remember you saying to me when you were having this conversation,
Yeah.
once I was praising you, you looked at me and said, but you know, you would have said to me that I was a fossil, and now I'm cool.
You see, that's the way it works. So today, no, but really, to be serious, I'm very happy that we can sit here on this panel today, and I'm not expecting these headlines tomorrow, although I say that the Bundeskartellamt has made use of the effects-based approach. That's not the point, but more in a sense that we refined our toolbox, and it was not a complete change of posture. So as of today, I'm also happy to be able to say that our posture and the legislator always went hand in hand, and we were very lucky with that. We had a long debate in Germany and many countries, is a zero-price market a market in the sense of competition law? We said yes from an economic point of view, but the legislator changed the law, and I was very happy about it because we did not have to discuss that with the Federal Supreme Court at length. That was extremely helpful. Second point, access to data as a parameter for dominance. I mean, this is common sense today. But when we started that 10 years ago, I mean, there were people coming around and said, I don't even know what you're talking about. What do you mean? So it was extremely helpful that the German legislator put that into law. We did not need to discuss it anymore with the courts. And then Section 19A. The legislator took a very close look at how long does it take to do these cases under Article 102, and the legislator came to the point, it takes very long. It's rocky, it's plastered with economic and legal obstacles, so we need to do something. Today, we have Section 19A. We have designated Google, Meta, and Amazon to be addressees of Section 19A. Apple is on the way. We will see about the outcome. We have opened many cases based on Section 19A with regard to conduct. In Germany, Meta offers Quest 2, the virtual reality glass, without forcing and obliging the consumer to have a combined Facebook account. You can use this virtual reality glass with a sole Meta account. There is no combination of data in that sense, so we make progress also in this respect. We have open proceedings against Google with regard to data processing. We're looking at the Apple App Transparency Initiative. We have so many cases going on based on the new law within 2 years only. So, you see, I think this is what I mean by combining the best of two worlds. I think our quite consistent posture over the years has also convinced the legislator to do something in this respect. And this is why I believe, since Section 19A is the only specific competition law with regard to big tech, I think we don't only have a great past, we also have a great future in this respect.
Great, thank you. I want to move on to, that's great. I want to move on to Andrea Coscelli, who has recently left the CMA, where he was the CEO. CMA, an agency which has developed certainly a reputation for being forward-looking, progressive. How do you, in retrospect, I think you can speak fairly freely as a former CEO, see the limitations? You've been quite daring, and that is recognized and praised generally. How do you feel that the law, as it stands, was a constraint on you, and what else would you have done to be able to do?
Yes, thanks, Christina. I mean, I think a number of things people have said have really resonated with me this morning. So I think logically you start looking at the outcomes. You know, you're leading an agency, you try to look at what you actually produce. And it was clear to me by, you know, being around, talking to people, I mean, like Tim was saying, you can trying to be close to the ground. I mean, obviously you're not a politician, so you're always an expert, so you're not as close to the ground as a politician. But I think it was clear to me that the outcomes we were producing, say in 2016 when I started, were not good enough. So the question is, you know, how can you improve things? And to me, and I think that's very consistent with a lot of, you know, my former fellow enforcers are saying, it's really a combination of various things. So first of all, you think, can we improve the posture, i.e., can we do more? And that's, you know, it's a cultural program in a way. You know, you're leading an agency, there are lots of people, there are people who have been there for quite some time, there are new people, and you try to think about, you know, how can we do things differently? And I think as Andreas just mentioned, the courts play a bigger role. You know, agencies spend a lot of time thinking about what they can do or can't do. Different people have different assessment of that. So you spend quite a lot of time trying to think, okay, within the boundaries of the law and the case law, are there areas where we can do more, we can do better? So that, in a way, to me, is a no-brainer. You know, you try to do that, but it's not easy. You know, it takes time, it takes effort. And obviously, if I look at what, you know, Lina, Becca, you know, Rohit have been doing in the FTC, and Jonathan and Doha and others in the DOJ, that's clearly happening in a very significant way there, but in many ways the same has happened across Europe in a number of agencies. Where then I got to, and say we got to as a leadership team, is that there was still a significant gap. The main gap was in digital, and so in many ways we had you know, an internal discussion which was pretty similar to what then went on in Germany, in the European Commission, about a complementary piece of legislation. Again, what helped me was I spent 5 years before the CMA at Ofcom, at the telecom and media regulator in the UK, where again, I think the thinking was very consistent with what Rohit is talking about financial services in the UK, where, you know, you really try as a regulator to actively promote competition, to facilitate entry and expansion, discovery. And so that idea that, you know, antitrust and regulation are complementary tools, different policy tools trying to do similar things, was very natural to me. And so I tried to explain and export that more to the agency. And so I think that's kind of the way we started with digital. Then you have another question, which is, you know, to what extent do you do these things privately with the government, or you do them publicly? And, you know, different people have different views on that. You know, you also have to remember that administrative agencies somehow have a quasi-judicial role. And so there is an element of, you know, if you want to change legislation, are you kind of marking your own homework? Are you trying to facilitate things for yourself? So you have to be careful about that. I mean, I think the way we saw it is that as an agency, you are kind of an expert advisor to government. You know, at the end of the day, governments and parliaments pass legislation, the dynamics are quite different. So what you can offer is your insight, your expertise, and publicly and privately you can help the lawmakers do it. But at the end of the day, those dynamics are different. And I guess that's probably why, you know, at the moment the FTC and DOJ are spending a lot more time doing their own things rather than spending a lot of time trying to change legislation in the US, because the dynamics are what they are. While, as Andreas was saying, you know, he was lucky in the sense that he had the lawmakers and legislators kind of buying into the vision and to the concerns that the agency had. I mean, in the UK, in the last few years, obviously we've been quite unlucky because the post-Brexit politics have made it really difficult to do any sizable domestic policy legislation. And so essentially there is, you know, There is a proposal, there is essentially a draft bill that I understand is kind of ready to go to Parliament in the coming weeks with this proposal, but obviously again that will be subject to the politics and just the bandwidth issues in Parliament in the UK today. But I think our view was that it was important to be clear and to be public about the concerns, the gaps, and that's the expert advice on digital, and there was in parallel 2 or 3 years ago also a letter going from the then chair of the CMA to the government with, again, the more general gaps in the, say, general antitrust and consumer protection framework. So I think my takeaway from my experience is that you need to be brave as an agency head, because I think if you see gaps and if you see the outcomes are not in the right place, you need to be vocal about it. And I think you need to try to do something about it and be clear about it. If I look at the current situation in the UK in regulated sectors, there are some regulators who are doing quite well, but there are regulators in some sectors that have really struggled, where lots of people think the outcomes are really in the wrong place. Areas like energy, water, where obviously we have privatized monopolies that have been regulated probably badly for a number of years. And I don't think it's an easy place as a sector regulator when you are presiding over these sectors and most people believe the outcomes are not good. And obviously it's not just the agency, it's a combination always of the agency and the government, and these things can get very complicated. But my learning is very much that I think you need to be relaxed about changes in legislation. At the end of the day, as we have discussed today, things change, you learn more, and you need, I believe in sort of cost-benefit analysis. I think, in a world where the courts are taking the view that they are just checking the application of the law as it is, and they don't put much weight on the implication that particular judgments can have on an enforcement program, I think you need, as an agency head, you need to be in constant communication with government about the problems and the gaps and make changes, because I think it can be quite inefficient to devote lots of resources over a number of years to litigation on certain points of law just to try to clarify them, when the reality is you think they're just not in the right place. And I think it's much more efficient potentially to clarify these things and move on.
Thank you. We'll pick up on these points in the next round, but I wanted to shift to Tommaso. We heard Tommaso from a current and recent agency head. You'd never had that position. You were, of course, chief economist in DG Competition, but a unique vantage point for you to observe what was the constraint and what was the right thing to do, what limitations you faced. And talk to us also about, you've been very vocal on the role of economists, what kind of economics you saw, and what kind of economics we need, in your view, going forward.
Sure. Hi, Christina. Good morning, Brussels. I hope you can hear me. And
All good.
Great. So thanks a lot for having me on the panel. And I'm very sorry. I apologize for not being able to be there with you in person. I'm sure there will be lots of friends in the audience I would have loved to spend some time with. But here I am. So I come from a perspective which is well known, that sees various indicators of increases in market power with not good consequences for our economies. And I also see trends, long-term trends, of not very vigorous enforcement globally. Globally, I don't have any particular agency in mind. This is something which has been going on for decades now. By not very vigorous enforcement, I mean that, for whatever reasons, very few cases can be brought forward, very few cases are started, very few cases are litigated, and so forth, because of the resource constraints, because of the laws that we have also, or the way we interpret those laws, and the standards of proof that we currently have. So that's where I come from, and I also make another observation. These trends have occurred almost one for one, almost a perfect correlation with the so-called greater use of economics in antitrust enforcement. So you have these two parallel trends: more economics, less enforcement, and market outcomes, which are not particularly positive. So if you follow my perspective, and many in the audience will not, but if you follow this, you need a big change, because we are not in an optimal equilibrium now. And so, with respect to the question, which is in the panel's title, a new posture, by new posture meaning being more aggressive, using provisions of the law we rarely use, bringing a new case, of course it will help, of course. But it's not going to affect systematically the bigger picture. Just to give you a number, and don't take it as a criticism, but numbers is also something we need to confront each other with. If you take the average number of merger prohibitions that DG Comp has had over the past 30 years, that average number is 1. So DG Comp has prohibited, on average, 1 merger per year over the past 3 decades. Now, imagine you double this number. You make it 2 on average. Well, this doesn't change anything, right? It's a marginal change, but it doesn't affect market structures. It doesn't affect the bigger picture. It will cause consternation among the lawyers in the audience for sure, but it's not a big change. So you need to be bolder. And this is perhaps, I don't know if it's just semantics, but I think I probably disagree with both Barry and perhaps also Andrea. So you need to change the law. I can elaborate further. It's playing around with both the burden of proof and the standard of proof. As I said, I can elaborate, but I want to turn to the economics. And also when it comes to economics, I can just relate to my own personal journey as an academic who's been an enforcer for a bit and is back in academia. And I am an orthodox economist, orthodox but progressive. It's even interesting that I have to qualify I'm orthodox but progressive, because it sounds like an oxymoron for many. So I am both an orthodox economist and a progressive economist. And I used to be an orthodox economist who thought we could do rigorous economics by keeping the consumer welfare standard, by stretching it, expanding it beyond the static price effects. Some, again, in the room may remember what we tried to do with the innovation theory of ARM, look at innovation in the Dow DuPont and various agrochemical mergers by Monsanto. We tried to deal with choice, consumer choice, in the various Google cases. So that's the way we tried to accommodate rigorous economics within a more flexible, I would say a multi-dimensional consumer welfare standard. But I have changed my mind. I mean, people are entitled to change their mind. I don't think we need more sophisticated economics when it comes to policy. Or let me even specify, I don't think we need allegedly more sophisticated economics, okay? Because it will create a big mess. It will create an even bigger mess because the incentives are wrong, because the resources are wrong. Because as you start bringing in something new, you will have first the profession that will react in consternation and trying to kill it. But then if you cannot kill it, of course, there would be an endogenous response, and the resources are asymmetric. You have well-motivated enforcers with limited resources, but the money, the rents are staying with big corporations that have a lot of resources to pay a lot of economists to adapt themselves to this new, more complicated economics. So what we do need, because you asked that question, Christina, we need, when it comes to policy, and I want to be explicit about that, when it comes to policy, we need simple and coherent economics that can provide actionable guidance to legislators in order to convince them to change the law. And I want to draw a distinction here between the economics which is being done by academics and the economics which is being done by the profession. So when it comes to academic work, I think what's currently very useful for policy is the work of those colleagues which are trying to look at the bigger picture, which are looking at trends, which are looking at insights that can hold true across industries. Okay? So that works on margin, on concentration, on market dynamics, and all this. This is useful because it gives you a way to frame a bigger question to affect legislation. Instead, it's much less useful what we do in academia in my field, which is industrial organization, which is what we've been using for the past 20, 30 years, which is the structural industrial organization methods, which are great for academic work, but the methods cannot be used in policy. There are not enough resources, there is no time, and these methods are not robust. So this work for policy is not particularly useful. Let me go and then conclude on the side of the economic professionals, so the consultants. So currently, we have a set of tools, a toolbox that we use in cases, which are simpler than the tools we use in academia, but they still look semi-scientific because we crunch some numbers. So this is, we calculate diversion ratios, we do merger simulations, and the like. This is where currently economics is when it comes to cases. The debates then among economists on both sides, economists both, they can be consultants, they can be with enforcers, it's a discussion about how robust the method is. Okay? How robust the results are given the assumptions on the method. And the discussion very soon becomes disconnected from the case. There are very few instances when we try to do some ex post assessments whether these methods were useful in practice or not. The results have always been not very positive, to say the least. These methods are not very robust either. So what I wouldn't want is that in the profession, what's going to happen next is we are going to devise some, again, semi-scientific, mechanical method to, I don't know, do vertical arithmetic by taking into account some quality parameters. This is going to be, again, a bad way of doing economics. Instead, because I do want to finish on a positive note, where economics can be useful, has always been useful, and will always be useful, is to try to think in a coherent way about a theory of harm. Economics can actually lead an investigation into the right direction, to talk to the right people, to find the right evidence. So economics understands business strategies, economics understands incentives. So this type of economics to guide a case when it comes to policy can be tremendously useful. Thank you very much.
Great, and this is a great perspective. As you know, I agree entirely with you, to the point that I've been described by some as a self-hating economist. Just take that away. So I wanna go and talk to John over there. A number of things in the earlier discussion, I think, touch on what I would like you to talk about. Becca later will talk about, in more detail, plugging gaps, and the incredible work that you guys are doing at the FTC. But I want you to also pick up the question of stretching, pushing, within the limits. And, you know, rightly Andrea and Andreas say, we have the courts. We'll hear later on from Advocate General her views on this, but the courts are key to this. One of the things I think I can mention, because now the case is now pursuing, is that, of course, you were involved in the Meta Within case at the FTC, and it has been seen, although the FTC didn't win that case, as a helpful set of progress to move things in a particular direction. So take it away. Tell us what you'd like, but this is the sort of direction.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that provocation, Christina, and thank you for the invitation, for the chance to be a part of this. I've found it generative. I found it energy-giving already. It's been a wonderful, wonderful morning. So maybe stepping back for just a moment before talking about this particular case, I think the thing that was exciting enough to pry me away from my comfortable academic life in beautiful Miami and to join Lena and others in DC, was that this commission, I think, it was clear, a very clear mandate, and that they were going to pick that up and run with it, to really use all of the tools in the toolkit. I think that's a theme that's emerging already. And, it's really try to see the big picture, right? not to simply apply an exculpatory narrative and use that as a way of getting rid of a case. For instance, seeing a new market and saying, okay, so this must be off limits to antitrust because it's new. Or a market with maybe some possibility of entry and saying, that's enough for me to conclude that anti-monopoly antitrust has no role to play. That was not the mode of thinking that was clearly going on, and that was very attractive, I think, to me. I think the academic debates, I think the internal agency practices had moved beyond those simple positions, but I do think that, to your point, the law has some catching up to do. And I think that's part of where this case fits in. So we want to very much to not just be looking at mergers in a vacuum. We want to be aware of kind of the buildup, what led to a particular merger, what's been going on in this space, and scanning the horizon, what's going to come down the road. And so at the same time as we're looking at a merger in a longer runway, I think, we want to be very aware that there are a wide variety of mechanisms that companies can use to lessen competition. So in recognition of that, we want to be looking at this holistically. We want to be aware of all the mechanisms for harm. We need all of our tools to be on the table, one, and we need them all to be sharp, two. And I think some of our tools over time had gotten a little rusty, right? Had gotten a little dull. And some of them weren't even really on the table, or it wasn't clear that they were on the table. Litigating vertical merger cases is an example of that, actually challenging them, trying to stop them. And potential competition, theories of merger enforcement, were another one like that, where the tool had gotten a little rusty over time. It was rusty enough, these are two tools really, that companies, including Meta in this case, actually argued to a court that this was dead law. This is dead letter doctrine. It's not a tool that the agencies have at their disposal. And so that's one, I think, very, very significant win that we got in court. We now have law on the books in the 21st century saying, no, that argument is wrong. There are two tools that are good law. They are very much at your agency's disposal in a way that I think they weren't before. The judge agreed with us. Meta lost its motion to dismiss our case. The judge agreed with us that these are valid legal tools for this agency to use. So now those tools are on the table, right? And I think they're sharp. They're ready to use. And if anybody thinks, we all read Twitter, right? If anybody thinks that's not a significant change or a significant win, I would say you probably have never been in the position of asking a judge to dust off a tool for you that's been getting rusty for 4 decades. That's no small task. It's no small ask. And I think that is a very significant win to come out of this. So stepping back then again to kind of bookend a little bit, I think it's a nice reminder that merger law, we heard a reference to the anti-merger law that we have on the books. It's not just a prohibition against harmful mergers and acquisitions. We talk about it that way sometimes. But it's also a positive expression, and it's a very political economy lens, right? Congress is not just saying, we don't like some mergers. They were expressing a positive preference for growth by internal expansion, by innovation, by hiring people, right? Actually rolling up your sleeves as a company and getting down to the hard work of building something new. So that's, I think, a really exciting aspect of our merger work. Again, that's a policy and we're applying a law, but it's important to remember the policy underlying the law. And if you don't remember that, I think you end up in a world where companies just find it easier to build, or easier to buy rather, instead of build. I think you can end up in a world where you've got a political economy of very concentrated, very powerful, but very brittle corporations that are acting as central planners, right? And so, I don't think anybody's going to be able to look at this FTC and say, you didn't try. I think, if nothing else, I think that's been made very clear. And I think we are continuing to try a lot of things with what I've said, what Lena has said is a fierce sense of urgency. I think there's this lively academic debate going on about whether there's really a concentration problem. But a second theme I've noticed already today is go talk to a normal person, right? Ask them if the political economy is just fine. is working well. And I think you'll get a pretty uniform answer that it's not. So we're trying to look with a clear eye at every deal. We're using economics. We're using great economists. You're going to hear from one, right? My colleague Aviv later on today. But we're not just thinking about economics. We're thinking about psychology. We're thinking about business strategy, and looking at a full range of legal theories, right? All the tools on the table, all of them sharp. We're not going to win every single case. No administration ever does, right? Our previous administration sued Meta and got dismissed. But the agency didn't stop there, right? We picked ourselves up. I think we dusted ourselves off. We learned some lessons, and we got right back into the fight. And that's what we're going to do again.
Fantastic. Rod, you've left the FTC not too long ago, sorry, the ACCC not too long ago. And again, you were amongst a small group of people like Andreas, Andrea, and others, Becca, who have been regarded as certainly trying to push forward, try to push the boundaries of what you were faced with. What are your reflections on where things are now, not specifically in Australia, but of course also there?
Thanks, Christina, and look, thanks again for a wonderful conference. It's terrific. I really agree with the point you made when you opened the conference about the wider importance of antitrust. And let me just reflect on that with a bit of personal experience. I came to chair the ACCC with a background as a public policy economist. I was the Prime Minister's chief economic advisor and involved in government a lot. And I was also involved in corporate strategy. I worked for a sort of upmarket McKinsey-type consulting firm. And when I joined the ACCC, I think I'm right in saying I had never met a competition economist. Right? I met economists in all fields of life, but never a competition economist. And I'm just trying to perhaps be careful with the words, but competition economics is in its own world. It is stunningly narrow when you look at it from broader economics. That is my observation. I mean, and when I came in and looked at what was going on, I mean, you've got too much gaining or maintaining market power by other than competition on the merits. That's clear. It therefore follows that antitrust is failing in its objective. That is quite clear also. And so this focus on, in the weeds, one case at a time, ignoring the fact that we're actually not achieving our objective, which is what Andrea said, is absolutely right. And it does damage society. There's no question if you have too much concentration, a lack of competition. I mean, competition is what makes a market economy work. If you don't have competition, you can't have a market economy. A market economy is excellent. I mean, it really works very well, but only if there's competition. If you don't have competition, it works very badly. I think if Adam Smith came back to the world today, he would think our market economy is not working as he intended, right? So people who use Adam Smith to say Chicago School, you haven't read the book. Go back and read it again. So, you asked whether competition agencies need a stronger posture or whether we need new laws. We need both. I mean, you need to look at what are the laws trying to achieve and take cases accordingly. When I came to the ACCC, we had 100% record of success when we took cases. I immediately formed the view that meant we weren't doing very well. If you're not losing cases, you're not doing your job. And when I said that, my head of enforcement came and high-fived me about 3 weeks later and said, "Yes, we've just lost a case." But at least the message was got. Our laws, I don't think, I mean, you can read the laws and say they're adequate. You can do that. But it's not right. It's the interpretation by the courts where things are that suggests we absolutely, so not only do agencies have to bring cases according to what the law is meant to do, but also, and not worry if they lose cases, but also we need to change the laws because the evidentiary burden to prove what's there is now way too high. Now, trying to think why is that, but what people forget, I think, is that the essence of corporate strategy, you know, if you work for a company, what you are taught about how you succeed is you succeed by gaining market power. That sums it up in one sentence. They don't sit you down in corporate strategy and say, look, the best way is just to outrun all your competitors and just be better than them. No, it's about getting market power. That 1979 article by Porter, which I know Tommaso and others say that I mention too often, that's a model that's been worked on. Yeah, it is, but read it in the whole. Read it at the high level. It's right. Of course it's right. If you're a company, what do you want to do? You want to gain market power. The only way you're going to get above competitive profits is if you've got market power. It's simple. And so companies put enormous resources into dealing with antitrust. And, you know, they've so complicated things that I think that's caused the evidentiary burden to be increased, a bit like Tommaso was saying. And so, you know, it is too easy to acquire a firm rather than compete. And it is much too easy for those with market power to prevent the entry of others. And that is just visible if you look around you. So we do need to change the laws. And of course, we're already doing it. In the case of digital, 19A in Germany, which was, you know, Andreas, Germany, you won, you were first. That has to be acknowledged. The DMA, and don't forget the DSA, that's the Digital Services Act. That is really, really, really important, as well as the DMA. And then, of course, the special market status regime in the UK, which, as Andrea said, would probably be law now if we hadn't had Brexit. So that's another thing you can attribute to Brexit. So we do need to change. So we're already changing the law. So if we acknowledge we must do that. When it comes to mergers, I remember when Andreas said what he just said earlier, that you know, if he'd have talked about a structural presumption, he'd have got killed by the economists. When he first said that to me, I was shocked. I mean, structural presumption is good economics. Why is it ever not? Economists understand that too much concentration is a bad result for consumers. That's basic economics. If you're denying that, you're a lousy economist. What's happened is we've got too much sort of economics by exception. I mean, of course you can show that 3 going to 2 in one industry doesn't matter.
But not this, but not this deal.
But you know, 98% of the time it matters. You just happen to pick the 2%. And the court cases are run by the 2%. They're not run by basic economics. So, Andreas, you've always been an excellent economist. Don't beat yourself up about it. And then thirdly, so we've got the new digital rules. We need to change merger rules. I think changing merger laws so that it's much harder to acquire if it can be shown that you've already got some degree of market power. That would be some form of structural presumption. I think that can work. And lastly, we just need more rules about what you can't do. I mean, think about cartels. Why do they work? Because you can't have them. You don't have to prove there's an SLC. No, you can't have them. We're not today, in any of the conversation we're having, going to talk about cartels. Why? Because it's not relevant to what the topic is. That's sort of solved. It's solved in Australia, it's solved elsewhere. Companies just don't do it. Now little companies do it and we take them to court, but it's not an issue. So we need, I think, more per se rules about what you can't do. Yes, it'll be rough justice, but I can't see any other way if we're going to overcome the evidentiary burden problems that are confronting antitrust agencies. And I'll finish on this. It is that I think business has to understand that it's in their interest to get antitrust right. If we don't get antitrust right, there'll be a whole lot of other policies which will be much worse for you than getting antitrust right. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Christine.
Very good. So I want to end on, getting everybody again in the conversation, but rather than asking specific questions, I'll put a couple of propositions out there that occur to me and are my view of the world, and then I'll ask each of you to comment as you see fit. So some of the stuff that comes out of this conversation, there are two main, or some of the themes, I can pick out two that come out of this conversation. One is of course, we're all aware that the ultimate sanction is the courts, and we all said it multiple times. One of the things that I observe, and we'll discuss it with Advocate General later on, is that somehow we are now in a position where we, through the more economics approach, have bashed that kind of line so much that the courts are beginning to get it. And so you're beginning to see judgment that actually adopt some of this more economic approach. And then I look at it and I think, oh no, this was not right. It isn't right. So the as efficient competitor test is now everywhere in judgment. And you think, oh my God, what have we done bringing that up? Because it isn't that great solution to things. So one is, I think that we have, the courts are have caught up into some extent in Europe with some of the economic message, but it isn't in the right place yet because we moved forward and we are saying that wasn't quite right, that was not a good idea. So that is one issue. The other issue is, going back to what Tommaso is saying, the useful economics one may do. We'll discuss the merger panel later on, work that academics are doing that I think is central to all of this. But how do we sharpen the tools in some areas where we really don't have much at all, and we really need to just fashion tools? So, I remember talking, and I hope I don't get out of turn, to Lena discussing things like ecosystem theories. I've discussed it with multiple people, and there is precedent, as I understand it, in the Supreme Court from the 50s, the 60s that looks at that. But then the natural response of economists is, what is it? It's vague. You don't have a tool. You don't have a mechanism. We can't talk to the hand. So does any of this resonate with you? What should we be saying to that? Tim, do you have any thoughts on this?
I would pick up the American Express case as a good example of what you were talking about in the U.S. Supreme Court of, a court reaching hard into some complicated economics and really making a hash of it. So there is some danger in what you're speaking of. If it's okay to just slightly step to one side of the question and react to some of what I've heard, I think, there is, in the American scene, in the United States, a lot has happened in the last 2 years, but there is, based on looking at the history, a real danger, I think, of a kind of premature declaration of victory, and a almost certain moment of kind of Empire Strikes Back coming situation that I think, and I hope my allies in the administration and the United States are ready for. And I think there's still, one thing I want to focus, there's been discussion of law and how much does law matter. It does matter, but I do think we have been correct to focus first on trying to change what is taken for granted, where the starting points are, in some sense affect a change in consciousness. A law is often effective less from what you see in court and more from what people don't try in the first place. An effective criminal law, when you think about it, isn't a lot of arrests. It's people not attempting to break the law. And I think there's been a change in what kind of mergers are even attempted now, and I want to emphasize that. Facebook saved itself competitive trouble by buying off Instagram and WhatsApp, but I think buying TikTok would have sort of been off the table to begin with. Even buying Snap at this point, they're dangerous, all kind of dangerous competitors, and from the get-go, that's not going to happen. And so I think we've been right to start there, but there is a real urgency in trying to institutionalize what we've done over the last 2 years. One thing I think is important for especially a European audience is to understand the common law nature of some of the changes. I think it's often tendency, and a mistaken tendency, it happens also in the U.S. press, to focus on, okay, but what did Congress do? Did they pass a law or not? And that's kind of your up or down. Did you win or lose? It's very visible. It's very hard. But in many ways, I say something I wouldn't say in government, Congress at this point is possibly the least democratic branch of the United States government. Judiciary is obviously contending for it, but I know it's an elected branch. You know, there are many things that 80–90% of the U.S. population wants that Congress will not do. There's a reason their approval ratings are very close to Hugo Chavez in the United States. You know, I think there are foreign dictators who have higher approval ratings in the U.S. Congress in the United States. Some, not many, but there's a reason, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But there's an inability of the legislature to do so. In some sense, they are the last, and to measure, you know, the success or failure of the movement by that is a mistake. That doesn't mean we don't need to pass laws. Congress is willing to spend money, and is willing to spend money in anti-monopoly ways. You know, we got a lot of money for broadband, for example, and I also think, you know, consistent with what Barry's saying, they're trying to break choke points by things like our semiconductor funding, our efforts to open up markets and dislodge. But I do think there's things we need to do to institutionalize this program. I have 5 or 6 things in mind, which I'll spare you, but maybe I'll post them somewhere. 6 things that we need to do over the next 2 years to institutionalize this program. But I think it's very important not to just have it focused on, you know, did Congress pass new legislation and totally amend the antitrust laws?
Great. Any reaction, Andreas?
Yeah, not a reaction, but just 3 very short observations. I think my first observation is that I think big tech with the zero price markets in terms of monetary markets has spoiled the game a little bit, because in fact inflation is already in place for a long time. But it's an inflation in terms of data. And if that data had been money, we would have seen how much inflation we have in these markets, and I'm pretty sure the legislator would have reacted very, very fast if he had seen to which amount the consumer has to pay for the service of these companies. Unfortunately, it was data, and it passed by unseen. So I think that is part of the problem why legislation is so hard to get. I mean, all the complaints that we receive come from competitors against big tech, not from the consumers. You must see that. And the consumer puts much harder pressure on the legislator than competitors. Second observation on the courts. I want to remind you that the start for doing more economics, at least in Europe, were the courts. There was a hard blow to the Commission, Schneider-Legrand and others, where the court said, well, you haven't looked at any effects in the market. This was too structural, that was too systemical in a way. So it was the courts that started that debate and that started that shift in the European Commission and in very many national agencies. So now we're at a different point now. And again, I think it is our task to take along the courts and to come up, and this is my third observation, with good theories of harm. And here I'm again at what Tommaso has said. I think this is the place for economics to show us, I'm a lawyer, theories of harm, and to produce them before court that are really convincing, as simple as possible, in order to be able to see the harm. And I think this is the place for economics. It's not so much about the effects in the market. I think that is a difficult thing to do. If you go beyond probable or likely effects, that will be difficult to do. But to come up with good theories of harm that will help us also to get along the courts to kind of a new strategy in terms of merger control and also abuse cases.
Yes, except that much of economics goes into developing what I call exculpatory narratives. And I was discussing it with Tim last night. Have you got a conduct? I've got an explanation, and it's benign. Just come to me. So let's hear more from perhaps Barry or Andrea, if you have any reflections.
Yeah, actually, I can on both of your questions, which I think were great questions on, you know, how to address the courts. You know, the way to address the courts, given some of the new law that's been made, is actually we preach the gospel of the democratic law as it was written to them. And one way to actually think about, do we need new law in the United States, right now is we actually have some very important new law. One of them is called the Sherman Act. One of them is called the Clayton Act. One of them is called the Robinson-Patman Act. We got the Seller-Kefauver Act. You know, it's like these laws are on the books, and they were hidden away by Bork and Company 40 years ago. Now, what the DOJ and the FTC right now are doing is they're busting out the framework that the neoliberals put into place, and they're saying, oh my goodness, we got new law, and it's called the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, the Robinson-Patman Act, and the Seller-Kefauver Act. So it would have been nice to have ACOA, but we don't need it. We got the goddamn law. Second thing, you know, is like, how do we sharpen these tools? We sharpen them on threats, immediate threats. And I'll throw two out there. One, for Europeans, here's a challenge for you. BASF. BASF has said, we're moving to China. They're going to take their entire chemical facility that's in Germany, and they're going to move it to Guangdong. Here we are talking about how do we actually move stuff from China to America? We're going to let BASF move to China? Unacceptable. Figure out how to police that. A year from now, let's have a plan. No, BASF shall not move to China. Okay? Other thing, America, Twitter. Elon Musk takes over a public commons and breaks it and turns it into his own tool. Not acceptable. A year from now, we're going to come back, a plan. Elon Musk is not going to continue to do what he's doing.
Andrea?
I don't know. I mean, I think if you look at some of the judgments over the last couple of years, you know, in the US, in the EC, in the UK, I think the change in the discourse on a platform like this one compared to 2018, 2019 has been very profound. But I think if you look at the actual results coming out of judgments, I think the change is very, very incremental. So personally, I think that if you can update the legislation, if you can convince lawmakers to clarify some of the points and remove some of the bottlenecks for these enforcement programs, I think some of the things Tommaso and Rod were saying really resonates with me. I think if you look at the overall program and the numbers, to me that must be plan A. I think the posture and changing the way you present cases to the courts, absolutely alongside that, but to me it feels a bit plan B in terms of achieving real change.
I'm going to give a minute each to Tommaso and John and Rod to wrap it up and tell us whatever they made of it. Tommaso?
Sure. So I'll finish with, and I know there is exquisite patisserie waiting for you next door. I will make an analogy which I recently made. I improvised in an interview I had. And when we're running a case, it reminds me of making sense of a potentially complicated puzzle. So when we were children, sometimes we were doing puzzles. There's lots of elements, and typically those puzzles are not easy to start with because the image you may have in front of you is a tempest by the sea. And you don't know if something is a cloud, if it is a wave, or something like that. But once you work on it, and this is the good use of economics, you can see how the different elements stick together. And that's where a useful, the bigger picture view that economics, the coherent framework that economics can give can be extremely useful. However, if in the way we run cases, or the courts interprets what the law is, they ask you to extract a single element of something, and it says dear economist, is this a cloud or a sea? You should respond as an economist, I know, because if I put that element in the context which I have analyzed, it can only be top left, and that's the cloud. But if the court interprets, say, no, I'm not asking you, I'm asking you to tell me whether that element of the jigsaw in itself is a cloud or a sea, and that's where economics can be very harmful. We are trained to come up with a story which is plausible in any context, and you don't even know how to interpret that element of the jigsaw. So if you use economics that way, or if the courts want us to use economics as a microscope, I don't think we're going to go very far and the situation will not change. If instead we economists and the courts allow us economics to make sense of a bigger picture, then this is where we can actually change the direction of antitrust.
Great. John?
So if the question is how do we sharpen the tools, I think it's tempting to look at the very successful project that the Chicago school sort of famously pulled off and see that they had a kind of unified field theory, and that was at the heart of what they did. It took them 25, 30 years to get there, but they came up with this nice, clever-sounding, very simple approach. And it's tempting to think that you need a theory to beat a theory, right? Everybody's heard that. Let me suggest that that's wrong, that you're not going to be able to come up with a robust enough set of policies to deal with the problems that we're seeing today by using a simple, naive theory. We've tried that. It didn't work. It didn't capture enough. Instead, I think what we need and what people have already been doing in a lot of different ways are a set of principles, right? Not a simple mathematical formula, but a set of principles like anti-domination, like openness, like resiliency. And once we've aligned around those principles, I think then we look at a kind of whole of government approach like Tim has suggested as a way to activate those principles. But again, not a simplistic, naive formula, a set of rich, flexible, strong principles.
Great. Rod?
Just quickly.
Take it away.
Look, I agree with Tim that we need to be careful about pushback because that is going to come. It always does. So we mustn't get too ahead of ourselves. Secondly, I do think we need new laws because of where we are now. We're stuck with evidentiary burden issues. We need new laws based on, as Tommaso was saying, quite simple, straightforward economics. And that's why simple, straightforward economics does give you a structural presumption. So we need, I don't think just relying on the laws as they are now and saying, let's just try and push them further is going to work. No, I'm afraid we do need new laws based on the best, straightforward economics.
That's great. Join me again in thanking this amazing panel. We're back in 15 minutes. Enjoy coffee.